Good morning, everybody, and welcome to Professor Richard Schultz Book Talk. Thank you for joining us so early in the morning if you're on the East Coast, but it sounds like we have members of the community that are outside of the Eastern Standard Time, so thank you for joining us as well. I looked out the window this morning and had this moment of, oh my goodness, it's snowing and people won't attend the book talk, but I guess that's one silver lining when you're hosting an event during a pandemic, that people are calling in from their homes and don't have to brave the elements. So thank you for joining us. My name is Cindy Rubino, and I'm the director of Ginn Library and Information Technology here at the Fletcher School. And I'm delighted to host this book talk for Professor Schultz. Richard Schultz is the Lee E. Dirks Professor of International Politics and the director of our International Security Studies program here at Fletcher. He has held 3 chairs: the Olin Distinguished Professor of National Security at the U.S. Military Academy, Secretary of the Navy Senior Research Fellow at the Naval War College, and the Brigadier General Oppenheimer Chair of Warfighting Strategy at U.S. Marine Corps. He also serves as a security consultant to various U.S. agencies concerned with national security. For the last 10 years, he has been a senior fellow at the Joint Special Operations University, where he teaches courses to foreign military officers on terrorism, counterterrorism, special operations integration, and asymmetric challenges to NATO. Professor Schultz has authored and co-authored over 25 books, 30 publications, and 15 book chapters. His research interests include U.S. national security policy, regional conflict and state disintegration, internal conflicts and wars, contemporary military strategy, and intelligence policy, and international terrorism. And while his career is quite impressive, on a more personal note, if you know Professor Schultz, you know how humble, kind, and generous he is to students and to his colleagues. And if you've been one of the lucky few members to receive one of his ISSP sweatshirts, it's super cozy on a day like today. So, published by Georgetown University Press, in Transforming U.S. Intelligence for Irregular War, Professor Schultz provides a broad discussion of the role of intelligence in combating non-state militants and revisits this moment of innovation during the Iraq War. Professor Schultz tells the story of how the Task Force 714 partnered with the U.S. intelligence agencies to dismantle al-Qaeda's secret networks by eliminating many of its key leaders. He also reveals how the task force altered its methods and practices of intelligence collection, intelligence analysis, and covert paramilitary operations to suppress al-Qaeda's growing insurgency and ultimately to destroy its networked infrastructure. So without further ado, I turn it over to Professor Schultz. Thank you.
Thank you, Cindy, for such a kind introduction. I really appreciate it. It's always interesting to to begin such a talk with how do you get interested in this? I got interested in it and actually have had a long-standing interest in special operations forces going back to the 1990s. Now, one thing I would notice that when we talk about special operations forces, there are different kinds. And the ones that I'm most interested in are those that are also sometimes called the Tier 1 force or the National Mission Force. And what this means is those units that make up something called JSOC. Some of you have probably heard the term JSOC. It includes SEAL Team 6, which everyone knows. That's the team that conducted the raid into Pakistan against Osama bin Laden, and Delta Force, and other parts of the services. All the services have components in the National Mission Force. There are other soft forces. Sometimes we think these are special forces, and they're involved in other kinds of operations that are not secret or clandestine or covert. Now, and I was interested in this in the 1990s, and wrote a book called The Secret War Against Hanoi, which looked at the use of these forces in the Vietnam War in operations against North Vietnam, but also in Laos and Cambodia. The way that and so Task Force 714 is the JSOC forces. It's a task force that was deployed to Iraq in 2003, and I got interested in it in the summer. I think it was the summer of 2013. My wife, son, and I were driving around Morocco, and whenever I go overseas, I pack a book that I intend to read. And the one that I packed for this trip was a book titled My Share of the Task by Stanley McChrystal, General Stanley McChrystal. And so I read this book, and I got fixated on the chapter or chapters that dealt with Iraq, and his telling of how he commanded the task force 714. He was the commander of JSOC, but he commanded forward the 714 task force, and he tells this story of how they were given a mission for which they were completely unprepared, and that mission was to destroy Al-Qaeda's secret underground or infrastructure in Iraq, and that organization looked different from anything that they had studied or planned to address, and so it was a surprise, not a happy surprise, and so he tells this story of organizational innovation and transformation. I mean, he gives you a broad overview of that, and so that led me to ask two questions. I thought there was a puzzle here, and the puzzle was something like this. Task Force 714 deployed to Iraq. Its original mission had nothing to do with Al-Qaeda, but it was given this Al-Qaeda mission for which it found itself unprepared. And yet it managed to transform itself and innovate. So my questions were, why and how was 714 able to change when it faced a crisis in practice? Now, what I mean by that is that a crisis in practice, Task Force 714, JSOC, was considered before Iraq the best in the world as a counterterrorism force, best in the world, and yet they got to Iraq, and they found that best in the world couldn't accomplish the mission. So it faced what I call a crisis in practice. All of its tactics, techniques, and procedures, which it had trained for and practiced throughout the 90s, it didn't work. And so they had to change. Now, change in war is not easy. If you look at the literature on military innovation, especially as it relates to wartime, you'll find that often militaries don't do well. But Task Force 714 was able to innovate, and so this led me to try to figure out, how they do it, and so I turned to the literature that in the business and management world that deals with learning and organizational change. And what I did was I constructed a framework, having studied that literature. I constructed this framework that I called the characteristics of learning organizations, and I used that framework to look into 714 and to see how its actions coincided with these characteristics of learning organizations. Now, I won't go into the nitty gritty of characteristics of learning organizations, but I thought I would just tick off what are they. And I found that there were 6 of them. Now, there's no one who, it was interesting that there's a lot written on learning organizations and learning innovation and all of that. But I couldn't find, someone that did this, created this framework for me. I had to do it. And so here are the 6, just so you know what I'm talking about. The first is that unforeseen challenges do not paralyze the organization. Now, this is a problem, because especially organizations that have had great success with what they do, when things stop working, there's a kind of paralysis that sets in. But learning organizations are able to get over that hump. Second, learning organizations have embedded problem solving as a core organizational competence. And problem solving is not something just for the boss, especially in today's world, complex problems. So problem solving is a shared responsibility for the organization as a whole, not just the leadership. In learning organizations, this is the third, organizational practices are challengeable by anyone and everyone in the organization. Fourth, knowledge collection sets in motion learning. And knowledge collection is knowledge about yourself, but also knowledge about how others who have faced similar problems have tackled these problems. So knowledge collection is critical. The fifth has to do with leadership. Leaders nurture a milieu conducive to learning. They are not the place where everything begins and ends. So there's a very different approach to leadership in learning organizations. And this is really exemplified by Stanley McChrystal. And have you not, if you have not, read some of Stan's works, or he has terrific videos on YouTube, it's worth looking into. His book on modern leadership is excellent. And then finally, organizations capture learning and retain it, but not rigidly, because contexts are always changing. So those were the characteristics of learning organization, and I describe them in the book. And then what I did was, because of what Cindy told you about my background, I was able to speak with and research and get into the task force and what they did in Iraq. Now, this is, I'm able to do it because of all the interaction I've had with Special Operations Forces over the years. At the heart of this transformation was the creation of something called a Joint Interagency Task Force, or the acronym is pronounced a JIATF. And Task Force 714 was really a highly compartmented organization, and it was not able to carry out operations fast enough to have an impact on Al-Qaeda's secret networked, dispersed underground in Iraq, an underground that was not just physical but virtual. And so what McChrystal and his deputy commander, who was Admiral Bill McRaven, who then took command of the task force, what they concluded was that they had to build a network themselves that engaged what Admiral McRaven used to always call the three-letter agencies, which by that he means the intelligence agencies: CIA, NSA, DIA, FBI, all of them. And they all had to be part of this task force, because this task force was collecting tremendous amounts of information, but it wasn't able to exploit that information. Excuse me. Now let me step back and explain how they were collecting all this information. So they would go out on these raids every night, and on a raid, one of the objectives of the raid was to do something called site exploitation, which means that you collect everything that's there. And what's there? Computers, cell phones, hard drives, thumb drives, paper, documents. And they were collecting all of this material, but they had no capacity really to exploit it. And so by creating this Joint Interagency Task Force and building partnerships with the intelligence agencies, they were able to begin to exploit this massive amount of material they were collecting. And this massive amount of material increased exponentially when, as a result of being able to exploit it, their rate of operations increased dramatically. And I'll give you two numbers to give you an idea of this. In August of 2004, the JSOC task force, best in the world, could carry out in a month 20 of these night raids against Al-Qaeda units. 20. By 2006, they were able to carry out 300 raids a month, 20, 300. Now, what that meant was that the volume of information that they were collecting was enormous. And so they had to construct or reconstruct the task force to exploit all this information. And they had to develop a new process for targeting that's called find, fix, finish, analyze, exploit, analyze. So these were big changes. Now, what I didn't realize at the time, and I really only learned this in the last year or so, was the extent to which Task Force 714 was really the beginning of the exploitation of big data. Now, I knew it, and I write about it in the book. They created these. They purchased through vendors data exploitation platforms that allowed them to search data in ways that were revolutionary at that time. Now we know more about this. But in many ways, this was the first military sticking their toe in the big data, artificial intelligence, machine learning water. And I know more about this now because of research I'm doing on something called Project Maven. 714 became an intelligence-led and an intelligence-driven task force. And what that means is that they had to change the way they thought about the intelligence operations interaction. So the person who understood this best, you'll know this name, the J2 for the task force was considered the best Army intelligence officer of his generation. And he told General McChrystal, he said, when he got there, he said, as I look at what you're doing, 80% of what you're doing is focused on operations and 20% on intelligence. And you've got to turn that around. 80% of everything this task force does has to be focused on intelligence and intelligence exploitation, which will drive operations. And 20% of what you do will actually be those operations. And he understood, I think, really well how big data and network analysis was going to drive this process. And that intelligence officer was then Colonel Mike Flynn. Okay, so he's pretty controversial. But he understood And he wrote some things about this that are very insightful. So the story is then how this task force was able to operationalize a slogan or a mantra that McChrystal used to always say, that it takes a networked organization to defeat a networked organization. And I once, in one of I had several interviews with him, and at one point I said, I think you need to make a little adjustment in that. Here I am, some professor telling Stanley McChrystal, he needs to make a little adjustment. But what I meant by that was that the way I understood what he wanted to accomplish when he said it takes a network to defeat a network, that what he meant was it takes a network that can get into the enemy's networks, get inside them, and start to see the lay of the land. Who are the critical figures in this particular network? And how do I identify them? And then once I identify them, how do I use my intelligence capabilities, which include a very interesting capacity through UAVs to watch 24 hours a day on targets. How do I use that to get inside these networks of the enemy and deconstruct them? So that was Flynn's real big contribution to this. And Task Force 714 was able to do this. And you can see as they do this, how the levels of violence come down in Iraq. Now, they were part of a bigger strategy, and I'm happy to talk about how they fit into a bigger operational strategy for attacking the insurgency. And one thing I want to say about everything that I did in this book and what I'm talking about here, all of this is at the operational level. This is necessary to success, but not the only thing that will bring you success. And I'm happy to talk about that. So what were the sources of transformation? Learning through organizational self-reflection. A lot of that in Task Force 714. Learning from the experience of others, and I can talk about who those others were that the task force learned from. Leadership that facilitated learning. All of these things contribute to success. So, and as I said, what I didn't realize at the time that I do now is that how this was really the beginning of how the capacity for exploiting data really was moving to center stage. So I think I'll stop there